I want to talk about nationalism, the development of nationalism in the 19th century, and at the same time the development of nationalities, and whether or not these developments, which took place in the course of the 19th century, aided or impeded the course of liberty. Now, many people at the time felt that the more nations who were submerged in multinational empires or in single countries became independent, the greater the cause of liberty would be advanced. Certainly Mazzini, Giuseppe Mazzini, the great Italian thinker who was so enormously influential, felt so, as did many of those who followed him around Europe. He believed that the advance of liberty depended on the freedoms of peoples, that they should free themselves from what he called the prison of nations, empires such as Austro Hungary or Russia, or perhaps even the British Empire. He had enormous influence. He was admired greatly by John Stuart Mill, who said, "One of the men I most respect." Later on, David Lloyd George, the British Prime Minister, said he was the prophet of free nationality. Mill, like Mazzini, believed that a nation was composed of people with a common sympathy, which, if it did not exist among them and any others, meant that they were a nation. In other words, if they had a sympathy with each other, but not with others outside this natural group, they were, in fact, a nation. And I think there we see one of the problems of nationalities, that it's about drawing lines. That we're inside the circle and they're out. And that may seem innocent enough, and it did seem innocent enough in the 19th century, but as we know, it could lead to very dreadful things and is continuing to lead to them. What Mill's view, I think, implies is that sooner or later there has to be either a separation or an assimilation. You either separate from those who are not like you, or you assimilate them until they become like you. And he felt in the case of the British Isles that the Scots, Welsh, and Irish would be happy to be assimilated to the English, that they were inferior peoples who would benefit from this benevolent assumption of, if any of you have ever watched Star Wars, or Starship Enterprise, there's a people in space called the Borg who say resistance is futile. And this, I think, was Mill's view of what should happen to the Welsh, Scots, and Irish. He was criticized at the time by a number of people, including Lord Acton, who said the idea of nationality is absurd and criminal. He said its goal is neither liberty nor prosperity. Both are sacrificed to the imperative of making the nation the mold and measure of the state. And I think there was a warning in this, which, again, as we look back in history, we can see was a very apt one. So where does this idea of nationalism come from? It comes, I think, as we've heard earlier on, partly from the French Revolution, partly from this transformation of those who were subjects into citizens, the idea that they shared something in common, that they shared values, that they shared ownership of the state. And of course, as we know in the French Revolution, many of the French revolutionaries, including their armies, felt that they had a missionary duty to carry this idea of revolution throughout Europe. And what they did as they aroused similar national feelings. It turned out that the Prussians didn't like being told by the French that they were coming to confer on them the benefits of a new type of order, a new type of society. And in fact, the French Revolution and the spread of French revolutionary armies really helped to spur the development of other nationalisms around Europe. The French Revolution, I think, was part of helping to spur this idea of nationality, but so too, of course, was the Industrial Revolution, because what it made possible, among other things, were the communications, which helped people to begin to feel themselves as part of a larger group. Communications, mass newspapers as they eventually developed, education, literacy. And so you began to get, across Europe, people beginning to identify themselves with larger groups. You also got people like me creating national histories. Most of the histories taught in European schools in the 19th century were highly national. They focused on the achievements, the disappointments, the triumphs of their own particular people. And they often read into the past a story of an unbroken progression of, say, a German people from the time of the Romans up to the present. In some essential sense, there were always Germans there, or some essential sense, there were always French there. And you got, I'm afraid to say, some absolute absurdities. You got, for example, the German professor who argued that German civilization was always superior to French civilization. And when it was pointed out to them that there were many wonderful buildings, cathedrals, churches, and so on in France, he devoted a good deal of his energies every holiday to bicycling around France, to looking for what he called Teutonic features on the tombs in the churches. And he came to the conclusion that the great achievements of French civilization actually had been done by Teutons. He said you can tell at once by their foreheads, their noses, their chins. And of course, you've got French professors who did something very similar, who argued that the only things that the Germans had ever achieved was because they had had the benefits of French civilization. And so you got the development of these highly one-sided national histories. You also got the promotion of national cultures, the attempts to recover folk music, for example, and use it in the music that was being written in the 19th century. Even such things as the attempts to recover fairy tales, legends, the Grimm brothers, for example, whom I read as a child, not realizing, of course, then that part of what their purpose was to try and show that there had always been something called a German culture. And so the combination, I think, of the ideas set in motion by the French Revolution and the great changes that took place during the Industrial Revolution helped to create this sense of nationalities. And I'm talking particularly because there are civic nationalisms, as Michael Ignatieff points out, when people live in a particular society and say, it's not bad, we accept we are different in many ways, but we accept a common set of institutions. That is civic nationalism. What I'm talking about is the much more common form of nationalism, and that's ethnic nationalism. This idea that somehow we're united together by shared religion, shared language, shared customs, and often shared ancestry. And this is the type of nationalism which I think increasingly came to dominate in Europe and then began to spread further around the world. Its impact, of course, was to cause tremendous problems for the multinational empires and countries of Europe, and then again further around the world. Austro Hungary, that great multinational empire at the center of Europe, began to be torn apart by the ethnic nationalisms which were developing within it, and eventually, of course, in the First World War, at the end of the First World War, was going to disintegrate. The great multinational Ottoman Empire was also going to suffer the same fate as it began to be torn apart by these different nationalities. And so if you look at much of the history of the 19th century, you see the developments of nationalisms, but you also see their impact on political structures, on the international order. The wars that, one by one, brought the Balkan states to independence, or the wars that created the unification of Italy, or, of course, the wars of German unification. I mean, these were wars fought because of the ideas and because of the capacity of peoples to begin to see themselves as nations. The First World War, of course, speeds up what is a process of disintegration of the multinational empires and also speeds up the development of different nationalities. By shattering the old order, the First World War made it possible for peoples who were identifying themselves as nationalities to hope, with good reason, that they would have their own independence. And I think one of the fascinating things, which perhaps you can talk about tomorrow, or you may want to talk about, is why nationalism so often only feels that it achieves its purpose in a nation state. That somehow, if it stops halfway, if it remains an identifiable nation within a much larger unit, it is somehow not achieving its true purpose. For most nationalisms, it is a separate state in separate borders that seems to be the final process which they want to reach. And that was certainly true at the end of the First World War. The possibility of independence spurred the development further of nationalisms. Also, I think we have to look at the impact of President Wilson. Wilsonianism, his view of a world in which nations live freely together, and of course, crucially, his notion of self-determination, which is not actually a phrase he used that much, but it became used around the world. It became identified with Wilson, and it was something which helped again to spur this idea that at the end of the First World War, there was this opportunity, this chance, rather like the end of the Cold War post-1989, a chance which may not come again, perhaps in a generation, 2 generations, or in centuries. And so the opportunity was there, and it was important to strike out and create a nation. Well, the Paris Peace Conference was not responsible for this, although it's often held responsible for it at the end of the First World War. But what it did was give international approval to these states which were creating themselves on the map of Europe and then further afield in the Middle East. Some, of course, were older states, like Poland, recreating themselves on the map, but some were very new, like Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. people's leaders in those countries, I think, saw an opportunity, as they did after 1989, to establish themselves, which was not going to come again. And although the peace conference itself and the statesmen who met in Paris are often held to be responsible for the creation of all these new states and older states, such as recreation of states such as Poland, in fact, in many cases, they were only accepting what was happening on the ground. Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, these states, Poland, created themselves on the maps. And what happened in Paris was really giving an acceptance to it. The League of Nations also helped with this. The new league that was set up helped to establish borders, carried out plebiscites in which peoples tried to decide what they would like to do, what sort of state they would like. Immediately, problems began to appear. One of the problems was identifying people. People in many parts of the world didn't identify themselves as members of a national group. There's a famous encounter that an observer from the League of Nations has with a farmer in Bohemia. And he says to the farmer, "What are you?" And the farmer says, "Well, I live around here." You know, what a stupid question. And he said, "No, what are you?" And the farmer said, "Well, I guess I'm a Catholic." No, that's not enough. "What nationality are you?" And the farmer had no idea what nationality he was. This was not a question that he had ever had to think about, not a way in which he'd ever had to identify himself. Another problem was the whole issue, which I think is still with us today, of individual versus group rights. How much rights does an individual have if they're considered part of a group? And you often got well-meaning people trying to tell individuals that they belonged in a part of a group, like the schoolmaster that a British observer met in the north of Greece, and in the disputed part between Albania and Greece at the end of the First World War. And he said to this English observer, "I'm going to make the school children in my school realize they're Greek. They're Greeks in spite of themselves. They spoke Albanian, they didn't feel themselves to be Greek, but the mission of people such as this was to make them feel that they were part." The other one I loved was the French separatists who were trying to detach the Rhineland, that bit of the Rhine, west of the Rhine River, and incorporate it in France. And they said, people in the Rhineland, well, they speak German, but if you look at them, they're really French. They have a joie de vivre. They like fine wine. They're not German. We just have to bring them back into the embrace of France. And so there's problems of identification often being forced on people being forced to declare themselves to be one thing or another. And of course, there was the problem with minorities, because history had not left all the Hungarians in a neat box on the map of Europe. It had not left all the Romanians in a neat box or all the Poles in a neat box. And so it's been estimated that when these different states were set up in the center of Europe between the two world wars, something like probably over a quarter of all the people living in them were minorities in whichever state they were living in. And that was a formula for trouble. Trouble within the state, domestic issues, because the minorities often felt they were oppressed by the majority, and a formula for trouble because outside states would intervene. Germans intervened to worry about Germans living in Poland. Hungarians protested to Czechoslovakia about Hungarians living in Czechoslovakia, and it helped to cause tensions all the way through. The problem, and this is the dark side of nationalism, was settled in the case of Europe in the most brutal way possible. The number of people as minorities in nation states in the center of Europe is much smaller now, or was much smaller now before the recent war in Ukraine, because the minorities were expelled or murdered or assimilated, forcibly assimilated. And that, I think, is always what we need to remember, the very dark side of nationalism, that it can lead to viewing those who are not part of your nation as other, detaching them from the nation and beginning to diminish them as human beings. And so I don't think Mazzini was right. It's very hard to disagree with someone who was so revered, but his idea that the development of nations and liberty went along with each other, I think, is wrong. Thank you.